and sound off during the presentation so it doesn't disturb others. Thank you, Monique. Over to you.
Thanks, Alina, for the introduction and the poll questions. The answers were really interesting, and I'll see if I can answer some of them.
I would like to thank everyone for tuning in this.
Ooh.
Monique, we're not hearing the sound yet.
Oh, goodness.
I don't know if you've shared the sound, but I also think it's that your mic has to stay on.
Let me, oh, wait.
I might be wrong, but I think that if you, even when you share the sound, if you press mute again, then it stops.
Hi, everyone.
Can you hear the sound now?
Yes.
Let me just quickly do that again. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in this evening. I'm very excited to share my work with all of you. And a big thank you to those of you who offered your gardens to me at my field work. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Monique Du Plessis, and I'm a master's student at the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology, and my project is funded by SANBI. At the FITS, I'm part of a research team that focuses on bird pollination in the Cape Rainbows. Specifically, we investigate how anthropogenic effects change the ecosystem services provided.
Did you put it on mute again? Because the
No. Can you hear me speaking?
Yes.
Okay, then that's really strange.
Do you mean the you, or you, the presentation?
No, me. So I assume you can hear me speaking, but for some reason the sound is not playing.
No, it was playing, but then it just stopped abruptly.
Oh, that is very weird. Okay, I'll try and play it from that slide again.
Monique, it's probably better. Can you perhaps speak to the slides? Because I think this isn't going to work unless it's a, it's a real technical glitch. Probably going to be the easiest.
Sorry, can't you hear the sound?
No sound at all.
Really?
So
okay, so I'll just speak then. Sorry?
Yeah, I think just show the slides and speak to them. I think otherwise it's not going to work.
Okay, sorry about that. So can I show it like this, because the sound will be playing and it will, yeah, never mind. Okay. So I'm just quickly going to delete all of these sound bars.
Maybe just put your sound off on your laptop.
I don't know if... Sorry about this. I don't know why, because we tested the sound earlier and it seemed to work fine.
Did you have your mic on mute while you were playing it?
No.
Monique D says share the sound. I don't know if that helps.
Sorry, Colleen, just say again.
I see D is saying that you should share the sound.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure.
There at the top where you see you are viewing, where you, and at the top of your screen, there's view options. Where sharing the screen, and then it says view options.
Share computer sound. Okay, let's see if it works now.
Wild bird feeding is a multi-billion-dollar global industry, which has become so widespread that it is essentially a global experiment. Yet its implications for conservation are poorly understood. Even countries are in disagreement about whether or not people should be encouraged to feed birds. For instance, in the UK, people are actually encouraged to participate in bird feeding activities because this has allowed the red kite population to recolonize urban areas. In contrast, however, conservation organizations in Australia discourage people to feed birds because they fear all of the potential negative effects that it may have. So with a lack of reliable knowledge, thousands of people worldwide feed birds with sincere intentions. One type of bird feeding involves the use of artificial nectar feeders to attract nectarivorous birds to gardens. The costs and benefits of these feeders also remain controversial, however. On the one hand, they could be beneficial by facilitating nectarivore presence in urban areas and allowing gardens to act as stepping stones between natural habitat fragments, and supplementing bird diets when floral resources are scarce. This may then facilitate their adaptation to anthropogenic shifts such as climate and land use change. However, this may come at a cost if they attract birds away from the plants they pollinate. Nectar feeders could therefore disrupt bird-plant pollination interactions, which could lead to reduced seed set in nearby populations. To date, the impact of artificial nectar feeding has only been studied in the Americas, where feeders have been found to be associated with significant increases in hummingbird and bat numbers. But whether this translates into decreased or increased flower visits remain debated and largely unknown. Plant-pollinator relationships form crucial components in the web of life. Most flowering plants rely on animals for their reproductive success and in return reward the pollinators with nectar. Pollinators choose to feed on flowers that provide them the greatest reward for the least amount of effort. And so the foraging behavior of pollinators drives the speciation of flowering plants as well as the other way around. To promote successful pollination, bird-pollinated plants have evolved attractive floral structures and large volumes of nectar to satisfy the high energetic demands of their bird pollinators. And nectar-feeding birds show a similar dependence on nectar-bearing flowers. Over 920 bird species across the world are recognized as prominent pollinators. Among these are the hummingbirds in North and South America, as well as honey-eaters in Australia and sunbirds and sugarbirds in Africa. Nectar-feeding bird species have long, narrow bills that are often curved to match the shape of the flowers they feed on. Bird-pollinated plants tend to have tubular, reddish flowers that contain large volumes of dilute nectar. Plants pollinated by sunbirds have a sturdy perch so that sunbirds can perch while they feed, but plants pollinated by hummingbirds lack these perches because hummingbirds hover as they feed. Nectarivorous birds can identify flowers that contain high reward and quality nectar using visual signals and spatial memory as foraging strategy. There is also more work, particularly by entomologists, that is showing that bees, for example, better locate patches of flowers when they have fed on nectar containing caffeine. It would be interesting to see if this is the case for these birds as well. This is the first study to consider the effects of nectar feeders on an African bird pollination system. This study was conducted in the Cape Peninsula of the Cape Floristic region, where birds are important pollinators because a disproportionately large percentage of plant species depend on their pollination. I carried out a feeding experiment in 18 gardens across 4 suburbs, namely Scarborough, Simonstown, Glencairn and Clovelly, where nectar feeders are often available in gardens. In this study, I focused on 4 nectar specialist bird species that naturally occur in the Cape Peninsula, namely the orange-breasted sunbird, Malachite Sunbird, southern double-collared sunbird, and the Cape sugarbird. The amethyst sunbird was not recorded during this study, but you might be able to spot them in your garden from time to time. The relatively short-billed orange-breasted sunbird and the long-billed Cape sugarbird are both endemic to the Cape. Here, the orange-breasted sunbirds are the main pollinators of bird-pollinated erica species, whereas the Cape sugarbird pollinates many members from the Proteaceae family. The Malachite sunbird and the southern double-collared sunbird inhabit a larger area of southern Africa than the 2 endemic species, and therefore forage on a wider variety of plant families. But even so, the Malachite sunbird is the exclusive pollinator of many members from the Iridaceae and Amaryllidaceae families. Nectar feeders also attract generalist bird species that include nectar in their diets. So to fully understand the effects of nectar feeders on bird and plant communities, I assessed all bird feeding groups. Some of the nectar opportunistic species that I recorded during this study includes the Cape weaver, Cape white-eye, Cape bulbul, and southern masked weaver. Nectar feeders may also indirectly affect birds that do not include nectar in their diets. This may be due to competition, for example for nesting sites, and therefore I also recorded abundances of non-Hectarivores bird species. Ericas are primary food sources for Nectarivorous birds. These bird-pollinated ericas produce clusters of long tubular flowers, whereas ericas with small round flowers are usually pollinated by insects. Erica species provide a useful system to test effects on pollination because their visitation rate is easy to measure. For this study, I focused on the co-flowering Erica plucinetti and Erica abiatina. Erica abiatina is endemic to the Cape Peninsula and flowers from midsummer to late spring, whereas Erica plucinetti is common in fynbos in the Western Cape and mainly flowers in winter in this study area. The principal research question of this study was, do artificial nectar feeders in suburban gardens affect bird-plant interactions in the Cape fynbos? To answer this, I aim to test whether nectar feeders affect local bird abundance and distribution, and whether this affects local erica pollinator visitation rate. I hypothesized that nectar feeders attract Nectarivorous birds away from natural vegetation towards gardens, and that this disrupts the pollination processes of erica communities. I conducted bird observations at varying distances from the gardens into the natural vegetation. At each site, bird surveys were conducted in 4 plots: the garden, 50 meters from the garden, 100 meters from the garden, and 150 meters from the garden. I alternated the presence and absence of feeders in these gardens, comparing bird abundance between sites with and without feeders. Each feeder garden received 4 feeders and remained there for 7 days. The feeders were filled with a 1:4 sugar-to-water solution, which is comparable to the concentration found in South African bird-pollinated flowers. Feeders were refilled regularly so that there was a continuous supply of sugar water. I did not use a red dye or food colorant in the solution because this is thought to be harmful to the birds and is actually unnecessary anyway because, like the feeders I used in this study, a red base, a red nozzle, or decorations are enough to attract the birds' attention. Bird surveys only started on day 4 so that there was enough time for the birds to acclimatize to the feeders. 20-minute bird counts were then conducted in each plot on day 4 and repeated on day 7. I estimated bird abundance as the maximum number of individuals for each species seen or heard at the same time during the 20 minutes. Observations were only conducted during the peak bird activity hours, either in the morning, which was 1 to 4 hours after sunrise, or in the afternoon from 4 hours before sunset. I also hypothesized that birds may rely less on nectar feeders and more on natural flower nectar during winter, when floral resources are relatively abundant in natural vegetation. So I conducted bird surveys in winter and summer to test this. To explore the possible ecological effects that nectar feeders may have on nearby fynbos plants, I measured Erica plucanetti and Erica abiatina visitation rate at different distances from the edge of the gardens into the natural vegetation. I collected visitation rate data only in winter because Erica floral abundance was too low in summer. I measured visitation rate before feeders were placed in the feeder gardens on day 1, as well as after the feeders were stationed there for the week. At each site, I identified 1 to 6 patches of Ericas, each patch containing between 1 to 6 Erica plants. To measure the bird visitation of each plant, I inspected the anther ring status. If the anther ring was still closed, the flower was considered to be unvisited. If the anther ring was broken, the flower was considered to be visited by a pollinator. And now for the results. The 4 nectar specialist species responded differently to the suburban environment when feeders were absent, such that the suburban environment acted as a barrier to some species, but not to others. Southern double-collared sunbirds were abundant in suburban gardens regardless of the presence of nectar feeders, confirming their more generalist habits. In contrast, the suburban edge acted as a barrier for orange-breasted sunbirds when feeders were absent, confirming that they are sensitive to the urban environment. Malachite sunbirds rarely occurred in gardens and natural areas up to 150 meters from the urban edge when feeders were absent. This is likely because long-tubed flowers, which usually contains more nectar and are preferred by Malachite sunbirds, were rare in these areas and more abundant higher in the mountains. Surprisingly, the Cape sugarbird was the most abundant nectar specialist species in gardens when feeders were absent. But when feeders were present, however, densities of all 4 species were much greater in gardens compared to gardens without feeders, and even greater than in any of the natural vegetation plots. So the attraction of the feeders was overall stronger than the aversion of the urban environment, even to otherwise sensitive bird species such as the orange-breasted sunbirds. So attracting nectar specialist birds with nectar feeders may increase the capacity of suburban areas to support avian pollinators. However, the presence of nectar feeders also decreased bird densities in the natural vegetation. Except for the Malachite sunbird, their densities actually increased in the natural vegetation close to gardens, but this is likely at the cost of decreasing their densities in natural areas further away. It is also important to note that nectar feeders attracted nectar specialist species over both seasons, regardless of the floral abundance in natural vegetation. This finding is particularly important considering that feeders drew them away from natural vegetation. This suggests that nectar specialists may be choosing feeders over native flowers, even when flowers are abundant. With this in mind, it is possible that they are decreasing their visitation to local Erica flowers when feeders are present, but I will get to this shortly. Unlike nectar specialists, opportunistic nectarivores preferred gardens over natural habitat, irrespective of nectar feeder presence, suggesting that other features of gardens also attract nectar opportunistic birds, such as exotic garden plants that carry fruits and seeds, and more structure for perching and nesting. But like nectar specialists, feeders also increase their abundance in gardens and slightly decrease their densities in natural vegetation in both winter and summer. So nectar feeders could also affect pollination services of plant species specialized for opportunistic nectarivores, such as aloe species, for example. There was no significant effect of feeders on non-hectarivores, at least in the short periods over which these experiments were run. It may be that over longer periods, non-hectarivores could be negatively affected by the increased abundance of nectarivores, through competition for non-nectar resources like nesting sites or other food sources. And now for the effects of feeders on erica visitation. I found that feeders in gardens negatively affected visitation to Erica plucaneti flowers. On average, birds visited 16% fewer flowers at feeder versus control sites during the experiment. This effect did not vary with distance and was still detectable at 300 meters. Future studies could clarify the exact distance over which feeders affect its visitation, especially considering that there is evidence of feeders negatively affecting hummingbird pollinated plants up to 3 kilometers. In contrast to Erica plucaneti, however, Erica aviatina experienced no detectable change in sunbird visitation. This may reflect that it is the preferred food source at the site, potentially due to its higher nectar concentrations compared to Erica plucaneti. So in conclusion, nectar feeders facilitated the crossing of urban-sensitive nectarivores into suburbia, suggesting that the attraction to nectar feeders can overcome the aversion to the urban environment. From the perspective of enhancing biodiversity in city regions, increasing the capacity of suburban areas to support avian pollinators may appear to be positive. However, nectar feeders also altered the local distribution ranges of sunbirds, regardless of floral abundance in neighboring vegetation. And this altered their visitation rates to at least one of the 2 bird-pollinated species considered in the study, possibly with consequences for its seed set, since seed set in Erica plucaneti relies primarily on sunbird pollination, although this would need further investigation. Seemingly inconsequential human activities like attracting birds with feeders is unlikely to threaten entire plant populations, but it could exacerbate existing anthropogenic pressures on pollination systems at city edges. So this study highlights the importance of considering the unintended effects of supplementary feeding on the surrounding environment. Longer-term studies are still needed to determine whether continuous feeding will permanently reshape bird communities and their ranges. Alternatively, bird numbers may plateau due to interspecific competition or increased predation risk. Longer-term exposure to nectar feeders could provide enough time for nectarivorous birds to form dominance hierarchies around feeders. And as competition increases and dominant individuals monopolize feeders, subordinate individuals may find the surrounding flowers increasingly attractive, eventually neutralizing the initial negative effect on Erica plucaneti visitation, for instance. Future studies should also consider the impact of nectar feeders on bird ranges at a landscape scale, since feeders may draw birds from considerable distances, affecting ecosystems deeper in natural habitat. This study also focused only on long-tubed erica species, but other plant families may also be affected by nectar feeders, since feeders not only influence the abundance of the main pollinator of erica species, which is the orange-breasted sunbird, but also that of the longer-billed nectar specialist species. Prolonged exposure to nectar feeders may have additional consequences for bird communities not considered in this study and would need further investigation. For example, long-term use of feeders may increase disease spread as progressively more individuals from a variety of species use the same resource. Nectar feeders may also influence breeding success in the long run. One of Anina's recent papers demonstrated a higher incidence of sunbird and sugarbird breeding in gardens with feeders. And this could in turn negatively affect non-nectarivorous species as they directly compete with nectarivores for nesting sites and other food sources. A common concern is that birds could become reliant on supplementary feeding if food is provided too frequently, but Anina also demonstrated that this is usually not the case. Another concern is whether feeders provide optimal nutrition value for birds. Anina demonstrated that the average sugar water concentration in feeders are relatively close to that found in natural nectar, so artificial nectar is probably of similar nutritional quality to natural nectar. Although artificial feeders lack minerals, amino acids, and some microbes that natural flower nectar contains, these are usually in small quantities and probably merely supplement the adequate nutrition obtained by feeding on insects. Aggregation of high densities of birds around feeders may also increase predation risk. Given that pets occur at far higher densities than natural predators, gardens with feeders can act as sinks if predation by pets is high. The presence of pets can also create an atmosphere of fear, leading to reduced reproductive fitness. So while there are still a lot of questions about the effects of nectar feeders, we can at least contribute by making sure to clean our feeders regularly and by using only normal sugar, not sweetener or colorants. Thank you.
So I hope everyone was able to hear that.
I think so, yes. I heard everything.
Sorry about those technical issues at the start. It seems I just had to press the share volume or sound as well.
No problem. Thank you very much, Monique. That was great. Yeah, so interesting results. It is it's just sort of a glimpse into this whole big complicated story, but at least we're now getting an idea that these feeders seem to have an effect on birds to some extent, and at least on some plant species. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? You're welcome to also type them in the chat if you want. Otherwise, you can just unmute yourself and or raise your hand if you know how to do that. I've almost forgotten how to do that in Zoom. But yeah, any comments, suggestions, questions, or anything that was unclear from the talk, you're also welcome to ask.
Hi, Monica. Thanks for the presentation. It was awesome. Really, really amazing. I just like regarding the nutrition quality of the sugar, the sugar water or whatever. Now, as well know, white sugar is not very good for humans, I mean, how can that be kind of okay for birds? Do you know any other research out there regarding the topic?
I think Anina will probably be able to answer this better, but as far as I understand, the sugar, like normal sugar that we know, is very similar to that found in natural nectar. So if birds are able to feed on the nectar of flowers, then it should be fine to feed on the artificial nectar. Anina, do you maybe have something to add there?
Well, it sounds as if you're asking particularly about the quantity of sugar. Is it okay for them to drink that much?
Is that your question?
No, it's more regarding the quality of the white sugar. I know that, for example, white sugar is very processed. They use a lot of chemicals to get that white color, and how that. Now, I'm sure that should. I mean, if that affect humans, can also affect birds. I'm assuming.
Look, I'm not an expert on the physiology. As far as we know, that sugar is the base. It's also made up of sucrose, which is what is found in the nectar, and which is what these birds are built to digest and use as an energy source. So, from what we know so far, it's that sugar is very similar to what they get in nature, and we don't know of any harmful effects yet. There might be, the thing that we are unsure of currently is about the trace elements, the minerals and amino acids and ions and things which occur in very small quantities in nectar, which is not in that sugar water that you use, and how beneficial that is. And there's also things like microbes, bacteria, and yeast, and microorganisms like that in nectar, which we don't know what role that plays, perhaps in the gut microbes of the birds. But yeah, we definitely need some more research. But this sugar is something that people have been feeding birds and hummingbirds for many years. and it's not clear if there is a negative effect. It's not very big. What does have a very big negative effect is those artificial sweeteners. I'm sure you've heard of the incident where I think it was it xylitol that was put into a feeder, and it, sugar birds died because of that, because they can't digest that. So they can only digest certain types of sugars. But yeah, from what we currently know, that sugar, normal table sugar, is fine.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Anina.
Yes, Colleen.
Mute myself. Yeah, do either of you have any recommendations on how frequently the sugar water feeders should be? So if people decide to keep them, how frequently they should be cleaned to stop microbes or disease spread?
As regularly as possible. In my short-term study, I already saw some buildup of mold. So it is really quickly. So I would suggest at least once a week. My recommendation. That might be a bit extreme, but yeah, you better safe than sorry, because it does build up, especially if you have a feeder that was already built up mold previously, and now you're reusing it. So it just keeps on building diseases and bacteria and molds and things.
Yeah, so I don't know, but I guess every time, if you could just give it a rinse and a scrub every time you refill it, that would be ideal. So you can just rinse it with hot water, like almost boiling water, and there are certain chemicals that you can use to clean it. But what's important, what we forget about sometimes, is the perch, or the surfaces where the birds sit on. So it's not just the bottle where the water is in, but especially the surfaces that the birds touch and where they sit on, that needs to be cleaned as well, because there can be stuff on their feet or feathers. And that's how they can also do, what's the word? Spread the diseases. So just give those surfaces a scrub. Yeah, you can watch that also with just the environmentally safe detergent or something.
And when you mix the sugar water solution, then it's also preferable to boil the water, make sure that any bacteria in the water is also killed. And then there's also questions about tap water. Sometimes there's, not sure, is it chemicals or let's say chemicals, that's it, that comes from the tap water if it's not filtered. So boiling it is helps with that, at least.
Yeah, otherwise fresh water, what's that, like, what to say, fountain water. Yes, those kind of things, distilled water or fountain water.
But mainly one probably shouldn't put them in your garden.
Yeah, I think I just think better safe than sorry. If you want to attract birds to your garden, then I think a safer way is to actually plant bird-friendly plants that are native to the area, like ericas and proteas, and have a variety of different types of flowering plants that cater for different types of species. And you can supplement it with a feeder, but I can guarantee you will probably attract enough birds without the feeder. But if you want to use a feeder, because there's still a lot of questions and there's still a lack of evidence of it being harmful, for instance, to the birds themselves, but also to the environment, then just be mindful and then just be responsible in the way you use it, like cleaning it regularly and so forth.
Just another question from us. We use a lot of water bath, you know, and we attract a lot of birds with that. Any thoughts about that?
The water bath.
They are good. Yeah, they're good. Or
yeah, so a lot of birds enjoy the water bath, and it is a great way to attract all kinds of birds. The sunbirds also use them a lot, I've seen. So yes, that's part of creating a bird-friendly garden. So water baths, flowering plants, a lot of places for them to perch, or natural shrubs that has enough perching areas for the birds, and cover, because they can sometimes be a little shy. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think water baths is a great way to attract and help the birds, but that's also something that needs a bit of a scrub and a clean now and then.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we should remember is that the sunbirds don't drink only sugar, but they also eat insects to get their nitrogen and the other nutrients that they need. So if you have a garden that attracts a lot of insects, that's also great for the sunbirds. And spiders, they eat spiders and they collect the spider webs for their nests as well. So just overall bird and insect friendly gardens are great for them.
So I see a question why people should feed birds, because they do have enough flowers in the natural environment. So one of the reasons why people feed birds is because they want more birds in the garden, but the better reason is probably because there are remnant patches of natural vegetation throughout the city regions, but sunbirds, or like the orange-breasted sunbird and the Cape sugarbird, for instance, are very sensitive to the urban environment, and so they need a bit of extra effort to attract them into urban regions so that they can actually go and pollinate those flowers. Because, for instance, the southern double-collared sunbird occurs throughout the urban areas, but it is unable to successfully pollinate many of those longer-tubed flowers, because only, for instance, the Malachite Sunbird or the Cape sugarbird can successfully pollinate them. So the southern double-collared sunbird can feed on those flowers, but they probably rob them by probing their beak at the bottom, and then that doesn't pollinate the flower. So it's actually more to protect and preserve the remnant vegetation in urban areas, and not, you know, feeding the birds per se, but it's rather about attracting them into urban regions.
I was wondering if I can ask a question. Do you think there's any role for feeding birds after big fires, when a lot of the vegetation's been burnt, or do they, because the sunbirds seem to move around quite a lot at that stage?
Yeah, so I know there's a study that, or maybe more than one, that showed that birds do move away when there was a fire. So sunbirds and Cape sugarbirds go to other areas to feed, because they no longer have flowering plants for them in that area. So the numbers are very low. So maybe, yes, that is probably one of the reasons people do feed birds in those times when there was a fire, because they want them to relocate there. But I wonder whether what would be the purpose of that, to have them there if there are no flowers to pollinate. But it will probably be the same reason, attracting birds to the urban areas, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that after fires in Scarborough, all the sugarbirds and sunbirds would be forced to leave, and it would probably take a few years for them for the vegetation to grow back, for them to come back.
Yes, exactly. So people will probably miss those birds, so they might want to attract them there.
Yeah.
But it's not all about people, so we have to consider the birds themselves, but also the rest of the environment, yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and something that we should remember is that urban areas has replaced natural veld that used to be there. So especially in the fynbos, the mountains still have fynbos, but the lowlands have been transformed to urban areas or agriculture or whatever. Historically, perhaps the birds would have, if there was a fire, they would have been able to move more freely to another area that's unburnt and that still has food resources for them. So to some extent, feeders can fill that gap that humans have created by transforming the landscape to just give them that refuge, a safe space to survive during that critical time when a large part of their resources has been removed. I mean, I don't think there are studies that really show how necessary that is or how effective that is, but my logic tells me that supplementary feeding, either in the form of artificial feeders or plants in urban or human dominated landscapes, can be a very crucial resource to help them survive large fires, especially.
Yeah. Sorry, and I'm sorry if I overlooked this, but did you check seed sets at all in any of these ericas? Or because I noticed that the number of the effect on ericas was significant, but reasonably small. So, I mean, because some people will argue that feeding birds in their garden gives them a special interaction with nature that they might not otherwise have as effectively and as easily. And so there's a human benefit there. It might also buffer them during birds in months of the year when the nectar is very low. And the cost then, besides potential disease transmission, is a slightly lower pollination rate of plants on the mountain. But that rate that you mentioned was only a little bit lower. Is there any thought as to if this would be, I know it's statistically significant, but at what point does it really become a problem? I don't know if there are other ways of measuring this.
Yeah, so I didn't go as far as to measure seed set, but that's definitely one of the next steps. A lot of the studies on the hummingbirds in the Americas did that, and some of them found that the seed set was lowered, whereas others found the opposite, or no effect at all. But then we must also remember that this study is quite a short-term study, so the experiments ran over a week period, and then so it was just a week, but we already saw a significant effect. So I wonder whether if we did a longer term study, would this effect be more obvious, or would there be other things that come into play? So would the trend plateau, or so we don't know yet. We have to first do those longer term studies, but it is a possibility that the effect can become more obvious the longer we feed the birds.
Yeah.
Yes, and you mentioned an important thing, Helen, that benefit that humans gain from experiencing the birds' presence so closely in their garden and just that interaction with them. And I think we should also remember that this study was the location where it took place was in an area where the suburb is directly adjacent to natural areas, and that's where we expect something like feeders to have the biggest effect. But for people living in the city where they don't have gardens, they don't have plants, there people tend to disconnect from nature, and something like feeders and the pot plants and things like that help them to reconnect with nature. So we should not just disregard the importance of feeders in that sense. We should always remember the value that kind of conservation value that it has as well.
Yes, I agree. Especially in the COVID time, it was very apparent that people were longing to stroll in nature. Especially those that weren't situated on the urban edge, like most of you are lucky to have.
Yes, Monique, I see there's a question by Penny.
Yeah, do the birds have different energy requirements in winter? Anina, do they? I don't think so.
I don't know the detail, but in the fynbos especially, the sunbirds and sugarbirds breed in the winter, so they definitely need more energy because they're just more active making a nest and feeding the chicks. So in that sense, yeah, they do to some extent have higher energy requirements in the winter. But that's also when most of the plant species are flowering, which is probably why they're breeding in that season.
Yeah. And that was interesting to with my study, that I found that the birds visited the feeders during both summer and winter, and they didn't ignore the feeders and just went to the abundant flowering plants, which is what some other studies in the Americas have found, was that during winter, the birds actually started visiting the feeders less and the flowers more, because there was more flowers available. So that showed that the hummingbirds still preferred natural flower nectar and only used the feeders as a supplement. But in my case, it seems like maybe sunbirds prefer the feeders over the flowers, which is a concern. But this is the first study in Africa, and it's a reasonably small study considering that it was a master's degree, so it was short term. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of questions that need answering.
Yes, definitely. This is just the start of it. So there's still a lot that we need to learn and find out. But I guess at this stage, yeah, I think there's something to say about responsible use of feeders. But yeah, the best alternative also is just to plant the correct kind of flowers for these birds.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was most informative. Really enjoyed it. I think you've answered my question. My feeling was that the closer almost we live to nature that is still very intact, the impact is actually probably greater, and therefore I feel I would have to do more soul searching whether to have a feeder in Scarborough or one of those areas close to fynbos than actually in the southern suburbs or near the city. And I think Anina has kind of answered that question. I just wanted to know, are you still continuing this study? And if so, how long for? And is it in the same form as you did it for the short term? Or what does the future look like?
So currently there's no plans for me to continue necessarily. It's a possibility, but I haven't started with a plan or anything yet to do a PhD, for instance. But maybe some other people, students might be interested as well, or maybe I will continue, who knows. But I think that if we continue, that it definitely has to be longer term. And then more study areas, more plant species, definitely to see whether, because already it was interesting to see that the one Erica species was affected, but not the other. And maybe there are some Erica species that might be affected positively, because some of the studies in the Americas actually showed that. So yeah, no plans yet, but there's definitely a lot of possibilities, lots of
Opportunities, yeah. So I'm currently based at Nelson Mandela University in George, and I hope that I'll definitely hope to continue with this work, because I feel it's important, and there's still a lot of critical things that we need to investigate. So I will definitely try to keep investigating this. There was another question by Rob there.
could you remind us which ericas are best for sunbirds? So the sunbird species actually pollinate or specialize to feed on different types of erica species. So for instance, the orange-breasted sunbird effectively pollinates many of the, how could I say this?
It's long tube flowers.
Yeah. So, is that the question with long tube or shorter tube? Okay. So longer tube flowers are bird pollinated. And you can see the bird's beak is also shaped in that way. It's quite long and curved like it's sort of little bells that the ericas look like flowers. And then the shorter tubed, it's more circular. Ericas are probably insect pollinated. I think, Anina, a couple of them are wind pollinated. But you can physically see that it's way too small for a bird's beak to enter. So yeah, the longer tube.
Yeah. So most of the ericas are actually insect pollinated. So a lot of them are very small, often bell shaped. But the longer tubular, long tube ones are the ones that the sunbirds like, which are unfortunately the ones that are a bit more difficult to get. But I think they are at Colleen, maybe you can correct me, but they're at Kirstenbosch Garden and that, what's that nursery close to Cape Point? I'm sure they will have some of those species. Colleen, Monique, you can maybe show your slide again with the different ericas.
Yeah. Just trying to find the. That. Is it visible on the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So here you can see on the left side, the longer tube pink flowers are bird pollinated because they're quite longish. And on the right side, it's insect pollinated, bell shaped, small little balls. That's what I would describe them. And then at the bottom is also a longish tubed flower, but that's specifically pollinated by the long-tongued fly. It is, I don't think that's an erica.
Yeah, it is. So those ones have the fly pollinated ones have a very, very narrow entrance. So it's too small for a sunbird's bill to go in. It's just big enough for a fly's tongue to go in there. Yeah. But the bird pollinated ones are about 10 or more millimeters long. Right, are there any other questions, opinions? We are open to opinions as well. We're here to learn what your feelings are as well. So don't worry about any of that. We're here to learn from you as well and to find out what you think and feel about this subject as well. Okay, if not, no more other questions.
Okay, just one very quick suggestion. It might be a good idea to do a little bit of an awareness campaign to retail outlets or wherever bird feeders are sold, to make people aware not to add the red dye. you know, it's often also depicted on the pictures that come with the bird feeder or whatever. And I think people just generally, you know, they go by a visual thing and, oh, I can do that. And yeah. So
That's a very good suggestion, because yeah, I've seen all over where bird feeders or the nectar feeders are sold, that they sell those red dyes in the same packet. So you buy a feeder with the dye, and then because it's sold, people don't think twice. They don't think, why would a company sell something that's harmful, and why isn't there talked about it more? So it is, maybe we should talk about it. Yeah, so maybe we should be the ones to raise the awareness.
Just like to say thanks so much, Monique. It's been awesome, and Annie, yeah, it's beautiful stuff. And we're recording, and we're gonna upload on the YouTube channel. And hopefully, we can share with more people in the community and raise the awareness. You know.
Thank you, Carlson. I really enjoyed sharing it with all of you. And sorry about those technical stuff at the beginning. But I hope the message came across clearly, at least.
Thank you. Thank you again, John, and thank you, Colleen, and all the team. Amazing. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.